this lecture, I'm going to discuss the nature of justification and the structure of justification when it comes to knowledge, focusing particularly on a puzzle, the puzzle of the infinite regress of justification. Now, when it comes to knowing things, we can safely assume that knowledge involves justified true belief, the JTB account of knowledge, plus some consideration X to handle the Gettier cases, which we discussed previously. And if we sort of assume that, at the very least, that justification is involved in knowing, then it seems like justification is important to know. In fact, it's very important to know because truth and belief, while also important, aren't really things that we have as much control over. We don't have we can't go become, more believed, or, the truth is either out there or it's, not when it comes to a belief. Truth is objective. It's not something you have control over that you can do anything about. And similarly, your beliefs, the beliefs that you have, are more often than not kind of automatically formed by the cognitive systems that are in, our belief forming processes. When it comes to seeing something, you just have a belief about it, right? You see your hand in front of you, you believe that there's a hand there. When we make inferences from one set of propositions to another, we automatically come to have new beliefs. These things are, in some sense, like the construction of them are out of our control. Whereas justification, the reasons for our beliefs, are something that we can go after in a way. We can go try to find more evidence for the things that we believe. So given the idea that justification is rather important for knowing, it's really important to know exactly what it is that it is to be justified, or what justification is, or what justification confers onto beliefs that make them, true beliefs that make them knowledge. So what exactly is justification? What is it to have a justified belief? Well, there's one view that's rather popular called evidentialism. Evidentialism is the idea that justification for one's beliefs basically it just involves having evidence. S's belief that B is justified if and only if S has sufficient evidence that B is true. So the idea here would be that justification requires sufficient evidence, or just is sufficient evidence for a belief. But what exactly is it for something to be evidence? And what does it mean for something to count as sufficient evidence? So what exactly is evidence? At least one kind of weak constraint that we might place on calling something evidence is that evidence is anything that supports that a proposition is true, and that counts as then evidence for that proposition. So anything that in some way lends you to believe or helps you to think that something else is true, some proposition is true, that thing is going to count as evidence for that proposition. So let's take this example. Take the proposition P that snow is white. What kind of evidence might you have for that proposition? Well, here's something that counts. You take these two other bits of information and put them together, namely that snow is the same color as clouds in the sky most of the time, non-stormy clouds, and the information that non-stormy clouds are white, right? If you take those two pieces of information together, then it seems like they support the proposition that snow is white. Like if you were to ask, why do you believe that snow is white? The obvious answer is supposed to be, just look at it. Doesn't it look white to you? But, if you had to give some evidence, you'd say, oh, well, here's something that we all know is white. And look, these two things have the same color. But what is the nature of sufficient evidence? What does it mean to have sufficient evidence? Well, evidence itself can mean some evidence that you have for a proposition, or it can mean all of your evidence for for some proposition. When we talk of sufficient evidence for a particular belief that you have, that requires all or a totality of a person's evidence, right? So sufficient evidence requires that we take into consideration everything that the person has that supports the particular belief or proposition that we're interested in. So suppose you have some evidence for proposition P, but more evidence for the negation of P, not P, right? More evidence against P. Well, then you're going to have insufficient evidence for P. So take the example, like, that you have COVID. And what you know is that you've had 3 tests for COVID, 1 positive test and 2 negative tests. If you just take the positive test, that counts as evidence for your having COVID. But you have 2 negative tests as well, and those, in a way, count more strongly against that you have COVID. And so, taken all together, you would have insufficient evidence in this situation to believe that you have COVID. The belief there wouldn't be justified. In fact, probably the belief in the opposite, that you don't have COVID, would be justified. Now return to our dumb example again. Suppose you have evidence for proposition P that snow is white, and the evidence is proposition Q and proposition R. Q being the proposition that clouds are white, and R being the proposition that clouds and snow are the same color. You also have some counter evidence, and that counter evidence is that sometimes snow looks different from clouds, right? Well, question, in this situation, do you have sufficient evidence for believing in proposition P, even in the face of the counter evidence? Well, probably, given generally thinking a number of other things that you probably know. An issue here, though, can sort of begin to creep in. You might have started to think, well, wait a minute, okay, so if we've got P, the proposition snow is white, and it's justified by the propositions Q and the proposition R, well, how do we know Q and R? And how do Q and R confer justification on to P? Like, suppose, the person that we're asking about, snow and whiteness is blind. How could this person possibly know that, Q and R, know that snow is the same color as clouds and that clouds are white? What exactly is it that's supporting Q and R, right? If P is supported by Q and R and nothing else, but Q and R aren't supported on their own, how then could P possibly be supported by Q and R? I mean, Q and R, they too seem like they need some justification. Suppose, for instance, that S, our blind person here, does have justification for Q and R, right? They have this friend, A, and A has told S that snow is the same color as clouds and that clouds are white. So Q and R are justified here, but what exactly are they justified by? Well, they're justified by Z, where Z is the claim that things that person A says are trustworthy, right? Person S believes person A and believes that person A is trustworthy. And so now we've got Q and R backed up by Z. So now we have a picture that kind of looks like this. P is, that snow is white is backed up by Q and R, where Q and R is that clouds are white and that snow is the same color as clouds. And Q and R are backed up by Z, where, person A said Q and R and person A is trustworthy. But now what supports Z? Don't we need some further justification for Z now? How do we know that person A is trustworthy? So now Z, it seems like, must be justified in order for Q and R to be justified, right? Because if we can't believe Z, if there's no reason to believe Z, to think that person A is trustworthy, why should we believe what person A says? So Z needs to be justified in order for Q and R to be justified so that they can confer justification onto P. But how do we justify Z? Do we just reach for further propositions, like that person A has been trustworthy in the past, or that person A, just took a truth serum? Sure, I guess we could appeal to further propositions, but is that really going to help at this point? We're looking for justification, and it seems like what we just keep getting is more and more propositions, and every time we come across a new proposition, we realize, oh, I need a good reason for that proposition. I need more justification for that proposition. I need justification for this basic proposition that confers justification. So every time I come across a new proposition, a new belief that I have that's going to support these other beliefs, going all the way up to that snow is white, it seems like I need more justification. And now what's becoming a problem here is that we're getting ourselves into an infinite regress, because it seems like there's no plausible place or way to stop this request for further justification of beliefs or propositions. So now, what exactly is it that we can do if we find ourselves in an infinite regress, particularly with respect to justification? And this is a classic problem in the philosophy of epistemology. It's what exactly should we do when it comes to the regress of reasons, the regress of justification, when it comes to thinking about how we ought to say that we are justified ever, if at all. And there are three main options. Really, there's four, but three that are actually, responsive to the problem. One, we can accept the infinite regress, which is a view called infinitism, which basically just says, yep, justification is infinite. Two, we could say, no, justification ultimately bottoms out somewhere, and this view is called foundationalism. Three is the suggestion that basically justification kind of loops back on itself, or consists in something like a coherent web. This view is called coherentism. And then the final view, the sort of non-starter or unresponsive view, is to simply reject the entire notion of justification and go in for some kind of skepticism about the very possibility of ever being justified in your beliefs. The first option, infinitism, is basically the idea that in this regress of justification, we need to simply accept that justification can always go on forever. So for anything that you think that you know or that you believe, someone can ask you why you think that, and ultimately you don't get to answer with just because, right? You have to actually give further reasons, or at the very least, further reasons are always available to you, right? So ultimately on this view, justification just keeps going, and we're sort of stuck in this never-ending cycle or never-ending regress of justification. There can always be another reason that's found ultimately to justify some particular belief. Now, why should we not accept infinitism? What would be the downside to saying justification just works this way? Well, one problem is no individual human being has an infinite number of beliefs, right? So right now, there's a lot of things that you believe that you're not currently thinking about, but to say that you have an infinite number of beliefs, well, that would be pretty absurd, right? I mean, you don't have an infinite amount of space in your head or anything like that. And if justification is in some way infinite, well, then it would seem that you clearly must not be justified in your beliefs if ultimately you need to have an infinite number of beliefs to justify anything that you believe at all. So if you need a belief to justify your other beliefs, infinitism seems impossible, just on the basis of the idea that it seems like nobody has an infinite number of beliefs, and we would need an infinite number of beliefs in order for infinitism to be true. So no one would ever be justified. And it seems like people really are justified in some of the beliefs that they have. So infinitism seems problematic. Option two is a little bit more palatable. Foundationalism. This is probably the most classic view, and we'll discuss it more in a moment. Foundationalism says that, well, okay, look, when it comes to this infinite regress of justification, where you get it wrong is in thinking that there's no justificatory bottom, that there's no place at which it's fine to just say, you know what, this is where I'm going to stand. This is where I'm going to, this is where everything ends. The foundationalist view basically claims that either there's a bottom row of fundamentally justified beliefs, right? Where there's just, you got one justification to another justification to another justification, and then there's just one at the bottom that's sort of the foundational justified belief. Or it claims instead that there's something at the bottom that's sort of itself not justified, but that confers justification on all of the beliefs above it. Sometimes people think that this thing is a belief, or sometimes people think it's something else, like perception or something like that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this view also seems to have its problems. On the one hand, it seems rather arbitrary to say that a particular subclass of beliefs are the beliefs that are fundamentally justified. That is, that they're justified without, just sort of on their own, while other beliefs aren't. Other beliefs need to be supported by by beliefs in order to be justified. To sort of, distinguish between two classes, the special beliefs, these unjustified justifiers, or these fundamentally justified basic beliefs, and all the rest of them. Well, like, what exactly is the reasoning or the rationale behind, being able to do that, right? Being able to distinguish between these two things. It seems it would be arbitrary to just say, oh, well, it's because we're just distinguishing these things in order to solve this regress problem. That would seem sort of to not get at the spirit of what justification is, because justification is this special feature of beliefs that, beliefs that we think we know. It also seems like you really need a reason to say why some beliefs are justified and others aren't. And isn't that reason just more justification for fundamentally justified beliefs, right? So if you have these fundamentally justified beliefs and you're like, well, the reason that they're fundamentally justified is this, then it looks like you're justifying them, right? You're giving a good reason for them to be justificatorily at the bottom of this, knowledge foundation. And if you just say, that if you're saying now that if you're giving a reason, then you're justifying them. Similarly, if you just were to say instead maybe that there aren't foundational beliefs, foundational fundamentally justified beliefs, you could say that there are unjustified justifiers at the bottom. Well, then you need to tell some kind of story about how it's possible for something that's unjustified to confer justification, and how it is that something that's unjustified could possibly be in a good position to, support something that is justified. And this kind of story seems like, it might seem like magic. It's like trying to do something, trying to, I don't know, bake a cake with your hands tied behind your back. Like, not something that seems like you could necessarily do it, but we'll see. The third possibility to solving the infinite regress of justification is to appeal to a view called coherentism. On the coherentist view, justification is what we might think of as a global property of your entire belief state. The idea here being that, that picture earlier that we were talking about where one belief is justified by another belief, ultimately, the fact that snow is white, sure, maybe it's justified by your belief that snow is the same color as clouds and that clouds are white, but there's way more going on, right? There's way more going on than just those two beliefs. And the reason that you're justified in believing that snow is white is not just those two other beliefs. It's the entire state of your entire belief system. So on this view, coherence, whether or not your beliefs are justified, depends on whether or not they cohere with all of the other beliefs that you've got. And coherence consists in basically whether or not those beliefs are consistent with one another, whether or not they can be true at the same time as one another. All of your beliefs, you might have some beliefs that are deep in there that are inconsistent, and then ultimately your belief system as a whole is incoherent because there's a contradiction somewhere, living in your mind. But for the most part, when you're thinking about, why you believe that snow is white, there's lots of different reasons that you believe that snow is white, like having seen it and being told about it and so on and so forth. And all of these things kind of hang together all conferring a little bit of support to your belief that snow is white. And in this sort of circular or web-like dense knot, you get all of this support that holds for your belief. So coherentism is the idea, really, that justification doesn't work in this sort of linear fashion, but it all kind of comes together. It's in a way almost circular. There's problems with this view, though, as well. So lots of systems of beliefs are coherent, right? Right? Like take any conspiracy theory that is well worked out. That system of beliefs, that system of the conspiracy theory, is probably coherent. I mean, sometimes they're incoherent. Sometimes conspiracy theorists are nuts, right? But that's the idea. Take the ones that aren't nuts, right? I don't know, your Joe Rogans or something like that. Guys that have conspiracy theories that they're like, yeah, this seems interesting. Now, the conspiracy theories themselves are probably false, right? And in some ways are probably unjustified. However, that doesn't mean that the conspiracy theories themselves aren't coherent with respect to their own consistency. That is, they don't contradict themselves in their own theory. Now, that seems problematic because if ultimately the theory is coherent but not justified, then it seems like coherence and justification have got to be different things. They've just got to be different. Similarly, it seems like a system of beliefs could be fully coherent without being connected to reality at all, right? So you could imagine like a story world that someone lives in, right? That's fully coherent, and they have a lot of beliefs about what's going on in the story world, but it's all make-believe. And so in that situation, justification about things happening in the real world, it just seems like there wouldn't be any good justification here, even if the system of beliefs constructed in this make-believe world is coherent. Finally, we have the option of skepticism, of course, where we could just deny the infinite regress by saying that it never really happens because it never gets started. We don't actually ever need to know anything, or we can reject that we actually need justification to know anything to begin with. This, at least for other reasons, seems like a somewhat of a non-starter. Generally, skepticism is problematic, and the idea that there's never any justification for anyone's beliefs just seems implausible on the face of it. Now, there's one other way that one might respond to this issue on the whole, and that's by claiming that ultimately regresses aren't that bad, or at least they aren't that bad, depending on what kind of regress this really is. And whether or not the regress of justification is what we call a vicious regress or an innocent regress. An example here of an innocent regress would be like, okay, so suppose that you believe P, you believe that snow is white. So then it seems like, okay, well, if you believe that snow is white, or you know that snow is white, well, then it seems like you know that you believe that snow is white, right, P. And if you know that you believe P, well, then you believe that you believe P, right? And then if you believe that you believe P, well, then it seems like you also believe that you believe that you believe P, right? We can continue on with this kind of seeming regress, except that it's not really a regress at all, right? It's just every time you come to recognize, that you know something, you also at the same time can recognize through that you know it, or that you believe it, and so on, right? All the way down the line. That's not a vicious regress. It's the kind of thing that just happens all the time. You get this kind of cyclical spiral of reasoning. Whereas a vicious regress, in this case, is basically something that points out how it's not possible for anything to get off the ground in the first place, right? So vicious regress is to say, okay, so in order for something like A to be the case, then something else with B must be the case. But in order for B to be the case, then C must be the case. And in order for C to be the case, it keeps going down. And ultimately, it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be a place where anything gets started. And if nothing can get started, then we can never get all the way up to A. And so the thought here is something like, well, okay, take the regress of justification. Is the regress of justification a vicious regress, or is it an innocent regress? Do you need some beginning of justification in order for justification at the higher levels to ever get started? Or does it just come kind of for free? And ultimately, some of the responses to this view, in particular the foundationalist response, kind of basically says something like along those lines. Here's an example of an argument for foundationalism taken from the existence of the infinite regress, right? So this is in part of the reading, and this view is an attempt to say, look, there's got to be these things, these like justified basic beliefs or something like that. So premise one, either there are justified basic beliefs, or each justified belief has an evidential chain, that is, evidence that goes back behind it that supports it, that either terminates in an unjustified belief, is an infinite regress of beliefs itself, or is circular. That's premise one, is those are basically the three options. If either they're justified basic beliefs, which is what the foundationalist wants, or these other three options occur. Premise two, but beliefs based on unjustified beliefs are not themselves justified, and so no justified belief could have an evidential chain that terminates in an unjustified belief. So that's going to knock out part A of premise one. Premise three, no person could have an infinite series of beliefs, so no justified belief could have an evidential chain that is an infinite regress of beliefs. That knocks out part B of premise one. And premise four, no belief could be justified by itself, so no justified belief could have an evidential chain that is circular. And that is going to knock out C. So from this view, given premise one, it's like either there are justified basic beliefs, or A, B, or C, but it's not the case that A, it's not the case that B, and it's not the case that C. So the conclusion follows, it must be the case that there are justified basic beliefs, which is what the foundationalist wants. Given this argument as it stands, we can now sort of classify each of the different views in how it would respond to this argument for foundationalism. Of course, the foundationalist is going to say that this argument is sound, that is, it's a valid argument and all the premises are true, ultimately claiming that there are basic justified beliefs, and that they are the foundation upon which all of our other justified beliefs rest. The coherentist view is going to say no. The argument goes wrong at a particular premise, namely particular premise number 4, where the justification for one proposition can be another proposition, which is itself justified by still others. The idea here is that more generally a person's belief is justified when it fits together with the person's other beliefs in a coherent way, and a belief is thus justified by the whole system of belief, of which it's a part. Hence, a belief is partially justified by itself, and premise 4 here is ultimately incorrect. The infinitist response is basically just going to say that the argument goes wrong in premise 3, and that ultimately an infinite regress of justification is possible, and so we really don't exactly need basic justified beliefs. The skeptic, on the other hand, will claim that actually, because neither foundationalism nor coherentism nor infinitism are at all plausible, there's no actual other place at which the argument can go wrong except for premise 1 itself. It must go wrong right at the start, where it assumes that there are justified beliefs, because there just can't be any of those. Ultimately, skepticism will just deny premise 1 from the get-go. So which of these answers, responses, and views do you end up finding most plausible? Some form of coherentism, foundationalism, a kind of infinitism, or maybe skepticism? Nearing the end of this lecture now, I will discuss two forms of foundationalism that have become relatively popular. At least one was popular, and then the sort of newfangled version has become popular today. The first is Cartesian foundationalism. Descartes, the sort of, I don't know, the philosopher of epistemology in like an interesting way, really wanted to kind of prove, sort of build new foundations for scientific knowing, scientific knowledge. And he thought that the foundations of knowledge needed to be indubitable. Indubitable means that they cannot be doubted, as well as infallible, meaning that we cannot be mistaken about them. He thought that if knowledge was going to be built on anything, there must be some basic foundations, things that aren't doubtable or and that you can't be mistaken about. These foundational basic beliefs, that he ends up appealing to are basically beliefs about internal mental states, seemings about how things seem to you, about which you can't really be wrong about, right? So right now, you're probably looking at a computer screen, some kind of screen, and it seems to you that you're looking at a screen right now, right? It seems to me like I'm looking at a computer screen right now. And ultimately, the thought is, I can't really be wrong about that, right? I could be wrong that I am looking at a computer screen right now, but I can't be wrong about the fact that it seems to me that I'm looking at a computer screen right now. The seeming, plus my belief that how things usually seem matches up with how things actually are, lets me deduce, according to Descartes, that my belief that there's a computer in front of me is probably true, right? So the thing that I am absolutely certain of is that it seems to me that there's a computer in front of me, and then on top of that, plus my other belief that things that if things seem a certain way, then they're usually actually that way. That gets me to some good knowledge about the external world. Descartes thought that with these seeming beliefs, we would lay a foundation upon which we could build all of the rest of our knowledge. However, there are problems with this form of foundationalism, this view in particular. One is that ultimately Descartes did not realize that we can be wrong about our own seemings, about how it seems for us, internally when we introspect on our own states of mind. And the sort of the easiest case to think about when things don't seem right to you or you get it wrong, are feelings that you have, right? Sometimes you feel something, you feel like you thought you had a twinge of pain, it turned out to be an itch. Or you thought that you were feeling a certain emotion, and it turned out that it actually wasn't that emotion, or it was a fleeting emotion. We also tend not to have many beliefs about our inner states. So it's kind of weird to think that they're the kinds of beliefs that are ultimately foundational for us to build the rest of our knowledge upon, right? I mean, like, I usually, I don't usually go around thinking, oh, well, it seems like I'm awake this morning, and it seems like there's, a coffee pot in front of me, and it seems like the coffee pot is making coffee. And then going from, my beliefs about my seemings, about the states that I'm in, to, like, justifying or inferring that reality is as it is in front of me. We just don't tend to think about what it's like, what things are going on in our minds. Rather, we think about what's going on out in the world. And if we need to justify all of our beliefs about the world by appealing to our beliefs about our inner states, well, then that seems like more often than not, we're simply acting in the world in an unjustified way because we're not thinking constantly about what's going on inside of our own minds. A different and probably more plausible version of foundationalism has become more popular since the days of Descartes, in particular more recently. And this form of foundationalism is what we might call modest foundationalism. On this view, we try to say, or basically the idea is, that beliefs that are caused by basic sensory experiences are fundamental and foundational and justified in a way. These things are basic in the foundational sense of their foundational beliefs that can confer justification without thereby having to be justified exactly in the same way by other beliefs. The thought is something like this. Look, the beliefs that are created by our perceptual system, right? When I look at my hand, I all of a sudden have this belief that there's a hand in front of me that is created by my perceptual system, by my eyes and my brain working together. And then this belief just pops into my head, but it's not like there's a good reason that needs to be justifying this belief in order for me to know that there's a hand in front of me. These beliefs are justified on the basis of the reliability of the perceptual systems that we use in our everyday lives. So the thought process here for this kind of view is that ultimately there are some ways that our beliefs get formed, and the ways that those beliefs get formed, it sort of confers a kind of justification onto those beliefs without itself being a belief. And of course, in these cases, we are fallible. We can be wrong. Our perceptual beliefs can be wrong. So it's not like Descartes, where he thought that our beliefs, we need to not be mistaken ever. But other beliefs, the idea here is can be inductively based on our basic beliefs. And so our basic beliefs, at the very minimum, the ones caused by our perceptual systems, can give us justification or sort of start the ball rolling and give us a foundation upon which we can build to other justified beliefs. There are, of course, problems with this form of modest foundationalism, and the problems relate back to the initial problems for foundationalism on the whole. So on this view, there's two kinds of justification, it seems like. There's normal inferential justification, where one belief supports another belief, and whatever happens, between them. But it's very unclear how perceptual states, how it is that you're seeing your hand, somehow justifies your belief that you see your hand. So it seems like it makes sense how one belief can justify another belief, but it makes much less sense to say how one experiential state with all the bells and whistles and feelings involved can somehow confer this special thing that we call justification, or count as evidence for a particular belief. And so you get these two puzzles, right? On the one hand, the puzzle is it's very unclear what exactly it means to say that a basic belief or a non-belief confers basic justification onto a basic belief, while at the same time it seems unclear whether or not you're still actually providing some kind of justification for these beliefs through the normal means, right? Like by claiming, oh, well, I see this, my perceptual system is a reliable perceptual system, and so it confers justification on my basic beliefs. Well, what I just did there was give a bunch of reasons for believing that these beliefs are justified. Well, okay, so now it looks like I'm back in this game of justifying these beliefs from a different direction. And so again, this kind of modest foundationalism, while plausible and good for stopping the regress, doesn't seem totally adequate. At least there are certain aspects of it that seem like it still might need more work. Wrapping up, and in conclusion, I think it's helpful to think about this puzzle in terms of two analogies. And the question is something like this: when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to justification, when it comes to what it is that we believe and why it is that we believe it, is having knowledge or being justified, is it more like building a house, or is it more like fixing a boat while you're out in the water? And this sort of, it makes sense why we get coherentism and foundationalism as kind of two very plausible sounding views in this kind of case, because they kind of both seem to get certain things right. Why do I say that? Well, science seems like the kind of thing that where the knowledge base for science works kind of like building a house. We come to find certain basic truths about reality that we justify through doing experimentation. And once we come by those truths, we are able to use them to find new truths and support larger, more abstract truths, and come to have more and more knowledge. Now, the knowledge of physics and biology is all kind of has been built up over time, and more fundamental bits of the knowledge undergird larger later bits of the knowledge, right? Like more complex theories are undergirded by simpler theories that we are more certain of. Um, and so, foundationalism seems plausible as a picture for how we live our scientific lives, how we do our scientific research and thinking and knowledge building. However, other forms of knowing, other sort of more everyday forms of knowing, seem more to be like floating on a boat in water while trying to fix it or build on it or remake it, right, in a way where ultimately our knowledge practices in reality, we don't have any kind of foundations to stand on. When we learn new things, we have to change our beliefs on the fly. Sometimes beliefs that we have so this is just like, so like, think about the situation if someone like has a foundationally earth-shattering belief, right? All of a sudden they find out that someone that they trusted was untrustworthy or something. Now they have to, like, while living their lives, continually retool the inside of their belief structures. And this is basically like you have to take the coherent web of your entire set of beliefs and cut out the bad part and fill it back in with new beliefs to coherently fill out your worldview. And so I think that these two analogies both are rather helpful for thinking about the way in which knowledge and justification work and interact in our everyday lives and in sort of our knowledge seeking activities.